All right, hello everyone. Welcome to December's Webinar Wednesday here with the National Weather Association. We have a fantastic guest this month with us from the National Severe Storms Lab. Dr. Pam Heinselman will be talking today about an update on the Warn on Forecast program. We are excited to have her with us. We're excited to have you with us as well. They're still popping in here. Keep on coming in. If you are watching on YouTube, we will be keeping this up on the YouTube page for the foreseeable future. If you're watching on Twitter now, keep those questions coming with us on the hashtag NWA WebWed as in NWA Webinar Wednesday. We will be watching those. Trevor is watching from behind the scenes here for all of those social media questions. And you can also ask questions here on the webinar. Pam, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to thank the NWA for this opportunity to present on this topic. I'm very, very excited to be here doing this today. So a little bit more on who I am. I'm a federal scientist with NSSL. About a year ago, in a few months, I moved from working on phased array radar research to being the program manager for Warn on Forecast. And since then, in the last few months, the guy standing behind me in this picture decided to take an opportunity at EMC. And so Jack Kane is now there, and I've also taken on the acting division chief for our forecast research and development division. And you see all those folks here in this picture, all who have contributed in some way to this presentation. So I wanted to start with the most basic question in case some people in the audience are not familiar with Warn on Forecast. And I thought a really great way to do that would be to play a bite-sized science video that we had put together here at NSSL, and our chief Warn on Forecast scientist, Lou Wicker, is the spotlight in this video. I'll apologize in advance in case it comes across a little bit slow, but let's just go ahead and get this primer done.
The National Severe Storms Lab is working on increasing the lead time for severe weather warnings. The national average for tornado warnings is currently 13 minutes, but more notice would be helpful, especially for those in charge of moving large groups to shelter. Warn on Forecast will help forecasters issue hazardous weather warnings earlier. The project will give them more info about the chances of strong winds, large hail, and even tornadoes.
Currently, warnings are created by forecasters looking at the atmosphere outside, understanding its volatility, and then comparing that to how they see the Doppler radar presenting what's going on inside thunderstorms. Warn on Forecast is an idea where we're going to take the massive amounts of satellite, radar, and surface data and stick them all into a very high resolution prediction model. And then by producing new forecasts every 15 or 20 minutes, the forecasters hopefully will be able to use that model to produce warnings that extend out to an hour.
Before the National Weather Service can use this tool, it must be developed and tested. One big challenge will be deciding how to get the model predictions to the forecasters.
I'm going to keep this one very low. I'm just adjusting the track.
These hazardous weather prediction models are going to produce a huge amount of output. And this fire hose of data is just too much for forecasters to handle in real time quickly. So in order to help deal with that, NSSL has developed a related project called Facets. And Facets is the methodology which will enable forecasters to focus very quickly on the most important threats.
Once Warn on Forecast and Facets are proven to be reliable and effective, then forecasters will be better able to inform you of threats nearby. Learn more here and follow us.
Okay. All right, so hopefully that gives you a good primer on Warn on Forecast and maybe help you get into the groove a little bit after eating your lunch. So moving on, this whole idea that you've seen here for Warn on Forecast, it really started around 2009, 2010. And so it posed a grand scientific challenge for the group here and others that we collaborate with on determining what advances could permit the prediction of individual storms, like what we would really need to get to for warnings in an ability to extend lead time. And so we've been working on research and development for that over the last several years. And I've added on to that to also fill a forecast gap between watches and warnings. And that concept is very much in tune with the facets notion that was discussed within the video. And so, of course, our goal looking at these various types of innovation is ultimately to end up in the bottom right box over here. So what we have developed to date is what we're calling our prototype system, and we have a catchy name for that, UZ. You can see what it stands for on the screen. And what this system is that's unique about it, it's weather adaptive, it's on demand, so to be used just like, you know, when you need it, and it's frequently updating. It is a convective allowing ensemble prediction system. And again, the focus is on high impact forecasts and warnings, not only for NOAA, but perhaps other agencies and even industry. Oops. Okay. So the idea of having an on-demand or placeable domain is not one that's totally new to the National Weather Service. This is an example of the fire weather nest that is currently running. You know, we also have a hurricane nest that runs during that season. However, what we're talking about here is more of an ensemble approach focused on severe weather. So what might that look like? So when we say weather adaptive and on demand, the current setup that we have that we're running in an experimental mode is for the weather adaptivity of determining where a domain would run is through collaboration with the Storm Prediction Center. And so you can see an example, day one convective outlook on the screen. And then on the next slide, you see the green rectangle or square. And so that indicates then the domain that would be associated with that convective outlet where the most significant high impact weather is expected to be. And you also see that that is enclosed within a 3-kilometer HURRY, that's a HURR ensemble, which is also experimental background. And so that is part of the basic setup of what we do. Look at the situation, determine where it could be run, put the domain there, and then we have a dependency on a background model, which currently has been HURRY through an association and really nice collaboration with GSD, or the Global Systems Division. Okay. So just a little bit on the configuration details for what we ran this past year, and we've been running this solely in the month of May, a little bit into June thus far. And so you can see a similar configuration there on the left-hand side to what we saw in the previous screen. A little bit more about the HURRY. Again, this is a great effort by NOAA's Global Systems Division, the parent model. You can see it's hourly updated 3-kilometer, 36-member ensemble assimilation. Okay, you can see the different things that are assimilated into the model. And it's an 18-hour, 9-member forecast that's run every 6. So looking at New Z, what does that look like? Of course, it's a nest, and it's running at a similar resolution as the HURRY. However, one of the differences is a very frequent cycling analysis. So that occurs every 15 minutes, and we're also including in that things like radial velocity, mesonet data when it's available, and ghost satellite as well. The forecasts there are shorter term, so they've been 3 hours at the top of the hour, 3-hour forecast at the bottom of the hour, a 1.5-hour forecast, and each of those has contained 18 members. So that's the basic setup for where we are right now in our research and development. So next I want to look at some emerging applications that we have explored both through our research and through talking with users. So our first, let's see, do you guys see this looping? Okay, this is supposed to be looping.
No, it's not animating.
It's not looping. Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay, cool.
There we go.
Let's see. Okay, there we go. All right. So because we're using an ensemble, that allows us to look at things probabilistically and put out things like exceedance probability products, and then also look at what the magnitude or the intensity of various products might be. So on the left-hand side, you see the probability of composite reflectivity that's greater than 40 dBz. And so there we're looking at the exceedance of that specified threshold over each grid point within the domain. And so in this case, we're seeing that some of the storms, most of the storms actually initially have a pretty high probability of being 40 dBz or greater on this particular day in this 3-hour forecast. On the other side, we're looking at the 90th percentile of mid-level updraft helicity, which is a measure of rotation and updraft strength. And it can be very useful for determining storm mode. So for example, might there be a supercell occurring on this day? And a 90th percentile is a really nice kind of like reasonable maximum value. That's a good way to think about that. So in this case, we can see we have a high probability of storms that are going to be intense, both from a reflectivity perspective and some of them that show very strong signal in terms of producing supercell. And superimposed on here are icons showing what actually happened on that day from a storm report perspective. And so we see that the one storm in more southern Oklahoma, we had a really intense mid-level mesocyclone, and associated that with was a tornado, and other reports around the area on that day. But some areas, you know, where we had some intense streaks, there were no reports associated with them. But the idea is to be able to use information like this to anticipate storm location, mode, and intensity. And of course, we're also concerned with what's going to happen near the ground. This is that same day. And so in order to anticipate threats and impacts, one might be interested in looking at the lower level vertical vorticity. Here I'm showing the 90th percentile of that. So again, a maximum reasonable value, and then also rainfall as well. So it's not only about rotation and, you know, hail and wind and things like that, but we also look at rainfall. So another thing that one could use this for is in terms of looking at areas and evolution. How are storms going to initiate, grow, and evolve over time? And so in this particular case, again, we're looking at the probability of reflectivity greater than 40 dBz across Oklahoma, Arkansas, parts of Texas, and Louisiana. And so we can see in this case that a developing squall line is being forecast during this forecast period over Oklahoma. And one of the applications that we've been looking at, you know, in addition to a traditional weather forecast, is also for aviation. And I actually presented this slide and some other slides to the CWSUs in the southern region earlier this year. And we were talking about how we might be able to identify corridors that are open over periods of time in the forecast that airplanes could take advantage of. So what does this look like in terms of the model performance from a qualitative perspective? What I'm showing you here is called a paintball plot. And so each of the colors here represents one of the 18 members that had reflectivity greater than 40 dBz in a composite sense. And the gray areas are showing the 40 dBz component from the MRMS reflectivity, so that's essentially our ground truth. And so we could see that the forecast did pretty well with that developing squall line, which was really great. And some other areas we did fairly well, but there's also a little overzealousness in some of the ensemble members, both in this area and behind the front in Oklahoma. So focusing a little bit more on rainfall, it's something else that we've been looking at a lot recently, and in particular looking at location and amount out to the 3 and 6 hour period. So this is a case from Oklahoma, May 19, earlier this year. And so we're looking at probability of accumulated rainfall greater than an inch and the 90th percentile. So again, that maximum reasonable value. And so we can see along this line, there are some pretty high values forecast in association with that 3 inches and higher. Superimposed during that forecast period are when flash flood watches were actually issued by WFOs or weather forecast offices. And we recently showed this to the Norman office here in Oklahoma, and they thought that there could be some utility for using forecast for putting out watches in the National Weather Service. And so we'll be exploring that in greater detail as 2018 unrolls. But we don't only look at Oklahoma. You saw that our domain can be run, pretty much anywhere where we have a background model. And so I wanted to take us to Ellicott City, Maryland for a little while, and Maryland's where I grew up, so I always like to look at cases from that state. And on this day, on July 30th of 2016, we saw there was a heavy rainfall event in and around Ellicott City. There was severe flash flooding associated with this event, 2 fatalities, and quite a bit of property damage. And this study has been done by Nusrat Youssef, one of our SIM scientists. And what I'm showing you here is at the peak of this event, 6 hour stage 4 rainfall accumulation. So we can see greater than 5 inches of rainfall, in particular in this area. On the other side, what I'm showing is an outline of the stage 4, greater than 2 inches and greater in this black line and other areas. And so in general, in the area of Ellicott City, we see that the Warren forecast did produce at least a high probability of rainfall at or above that threshold and had pretty good aerial coverage over the Ellicott City area and some other areas, although we also see some displacement error. So with these types of cases in mind, and some proposals, along this line that have been funded, like a JTTI proposal, again, driven by Nusrat Youssef and others. We have some opportunities coming up to test these probabilistic rainfall guidance in test beds. And so in FY18, we will be participating as part of the FAIR experiment, Flash Flood and Intense Rainfall, at the National Weather and Climate Prediction Center. And then also we're working to get into operations at the Met Watch desk, so looking at the application of such products for mesoscale discussions, and then also, like I said, operations in the Norman office here. Additionally, kind of taking this a step further than where we are right now, we are wanting to develop the capability and test using probabilistic quantitative precipitation to act as a forcer for hydrologic models. And so our first step in that direction will be in coordination with FLASH in the hydrometeorological test bed. So we'll have something going on not only at the Weather Prediction Center, but also here in Norman. Pretty excited about that. So now I want to turn some attention to what we did last year in our spring forecast experiment. And this was really the first time that we brought out the model to be used in the spring forecast experiment, as well as within the weather forecast office here in Norman, Oklahoma. So what I'm going to start with is a case that the Weather Service office in Norman found the forecast from Newsy very helpful. And of course, we didn't just put it in their laps and say go. With this, their use of Word on Forecast really has come through a collaboration in which we've worked with them ahead of time to do some training and provide exposure to the model. So it was exciting to see that it could be used in some capacity within its, its first exposure in May of 2017. And so the specific case that I'm showing you here from Todd Lindley and Pat Skinner was prior to the 16 May 2017 Elk City, Oklahoma tornado. And what you're looking at here on the screen is from a single member showing a swath of high helicity values. You can see the values associated with them over here. And then also the last time frame, we're looking at the composite reflectivity from that member. And so we see some confidence and significant helicity values along the path and a storm that looks like it could be a supercell in nature. This is what the forecast looked like, with the end period being just beyond where the tornado actually occurred. And so this is 5-minute output, looking at, again, mid-level updraft helicity, which is a measure of mesocyclone likelihood, and then also the ensemble 90th percentile, which again is a reasonable maximum for mesocyclones. And so we see in both there's a pretty high probability of a mesocyclone and some pretty good updraft helicity values. And this is from the ensemble as a whole over this forecast period. So the outcome from using these forecasts in operations was a significant weather advisory. And you can see the text highlighted here. And as noted by Todd, the issuance of the advisory itself was not atypical. However, he felt that the confidence applied to actually forecasting a warning was unusual in an operational setting. So this is a quote from Todd that I know he's shown in presentations before, and how he found Newsy useful in this instance. You can read what he has to say there. And so it was encouraging just to see that the model, in its prototype version was found to be useful in forecast operations, and that translated to utility also by the EM in Elk City. This is just to give you an idea of how significant this event was. Again, it was EF2 tornado. It had a fairly long path and did a lot of damage, unfortunately, also injuring people and causing one death. Okay, so that's the end of that story. And we're now moving into more of the pseudo-operational experiment that we ran last year. And what we're looking at with the Storm Prediction Center, in particular through leadership with Israel Jarak and Adam Clark, is looking at the use of probabilistic guidance from Word on Forecast for experimental outlooks. And last year the focus was on 1-hour outlooks using the Newsy forecast, and again trying to fill this information gap between when a watch is usually issued and then a warning is issued. So this is one of the cases that we were most excited about this year. And here I'm just showing the composite reflectivity greater than 40 dBz. So now we're over Iowa country, and we're seeing some evolution into perhaps a Boeing segment here in Iowa. That part in particular caught our eye. And then here is some qualitative verification associated with the paintball plot. And so you can see there's a fairly good consistency location-wise in terms of where the ensemble members were, and that line, although we also have some other areas, again, that perhaps were a little bit overzealous or missed a couple storms. So you say, why was this exciting? Okay, one of the reasons why this was exciting was because it predicted a developing straight line wind threat. And that's exciting because it has been very difficult for us to have the model produce high wind intensities. And so this was one of the first cases in which we saw that occur. And what happened from that was in the test bed, the ability to issue probabilistic outlooks that look like this. And so here you're seeing an outlook valid from 21 to 22 UTC, issued from the 1900 or the 19 UTC warrant on forecast information. And you see the various probabilities that were put out at that time, and overlaid are the storm reports associated with it. And so all of these blue dots are wind reports. The green ones are hail reports. So we can see a later outlook for the same time period put out from the next run of the model. And from that, the forecasters were able, or the forecaster running this was able to more closely identify the pockets where he thought the most significant impact would be from a severe weather perspective. And then on the end here, we see what a practically perfect hindcast would look like based on where the reports actually occurred. And so again, this showed some promise for this as a warrant on forecast application. Okay, another thing that we did during the experiment was to look at interpretations of various newsy products. So we know that looking at probabilities of exceedance and percentiles, things like that are somewhat new, especially on this time scale. And we think it's very important that both developers and forecasters, we understand what their perspectives are and interpreting these things to inform training and also the development of products as the system evolves. So what I'm going to show you is some demographic information and then focus on just one question that we explored. So we had 60 of 62 respondents to the survey, and we can see the distribution here. So the majority were researchers, meaning they're employed as researchers, people who call themselves forecasters. So a lot of these were the National Weather Service. And we also had some students and postdocs. And over here you can see the distribution of female and male as well as the age. And so the majority were approximately mid-career. So the question I'm going to focus on today from the survey, and the findings here are credited to Katie Wilson. In an ensemble-based probabilistic forecast, what do you think the 70th percentile of accumulated rainfall represents? And so the answers given here are ones that demonstrated a clear understanding of this concept, and that was 55% of respondents. And so across here, we see the different ways that people expressed their understanding. And so here we have perhaps a typical representation where 70% of members have a value less than this. For the 70th percentile, we had 29 people respond that way, and we could see an example quote here for each of these. The second one, they're looking at more at, if you're at the 70th percentile, 30% of members are going to have a value more than this. So that was the second. Third, it's a high-end possibility or showing something akin to the max. And so we can see a similar quote down here. And there were some who also associated this to the probability distribution concept. And some people answered with more than one, or one or more of these ideas within their response. So on the other side of the coin, 45% demonstrated some misunderstanding or ambiguity in terms of their responses to this question. And here are some examples of those. The accumulated rainfall amount that 70% of the members are producing. Accumulated rainfall that at least 70% of the members agree on. And regions shaded represent the union of at least 70% of ensemble members. And so this told us that we do have some need for training in this area. And what was interesting is, with the answers to these questions and knowing the various people who responded in terms of their background, we saw that the lack of understanding really spread across academic research and operational areas in terms of their understanding. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about verification. You've seen some interesting examples, and we're going to look more holistically at some cases with a focus on the reflectivity forecast. And this is from Pat Skinner, who's our lead on verification and also on visualization of Newsy. And so what we're looking at here are 4 different measures of the composite, the reflectivity measures, and the comparison is between 2017 and 2016. So we were wanting to see if the forecast has improved from 16 here in the blue and 17 here in the red. And what we're looking at here is the forecast time. So longer forecast time as we go from left to right, and a variety of measures, probability of detection, false alarm ratio bias, and the critical success index. And so what we see from this is that there has been some improvement in the POD. We are excited to see lower FAR at all times during the 2017 forecasts. And let's see, there was a higher frequency bias in 2016, but a lower one in 2017 initially. Thereafter, it's fairly similar. And then here we see overall that there's an improvement in the CSI, of course, as the forecast time frame extends outward, that improvement decreases, but is still positive. Okay. So now we're going to look at it on more of a case-by-case basis. And first, this plot may look overwhelming. We're going to make it easy. So here we're looking at 2016, and here's 2017. So on the y-axis, we have the probability of detection. We have the success ratio over here, and we're looking at doing better as we move up to the right. Okay. So each of these members, or these numbers that you're seeing here, are from the dates shown below here. So 1 to 14 are these numbers. And this is the overall score. The little dots show the various members from those dates. And so ones in the red are days in which there was a enhanced risk for supercells or greater than or equal to. Orange, same enhanced risk, but for a different mode, so mixed or linear. And then green and blue for less than an enhanced risk issued by the Storm Prediction Center. But really the takeaway from this slide is that we have gone to a more consistent performance in 2017 compared to 2016. And it's also kind of pushed more toward the area where we want it to be, kind of the middle toward the upper right compared to holistically in 2016. Okay. So what I wanted to close with is looking at where are we now? Where are we relative to that 2020 date that I threw out there in the title of this talk? And where are we headed? So we recently, really just the last couple weeks, had a visit to EMC and gave a presentation on the topic I'm talking with you guys today. And we put forth 3 different options for warn-on forecasts that could be transitioned. I'm going to show you 2 of those here today. And so the first one is what we're calling the starter system. So this would be, you know, like warn on forecast V1 or Newsy V1. And so the setup that you're seeing here is what I talked about earlier today, perhaps with just a few more members in the analysis cycle and within the forecast cycle, hitting that watch to warning guidance. And so we think with some more testing and further development that builds on what we have today, we would be able to get something to operations by FY22. And the requirements for this system on its own is less than 2,000 cores, which isn't too unreasonable. And it's what we're running today at NSSL. So on the more ultimate side of things, which is what the video was aimed at that you saw at the beginning of this presentation, is looking at a grid that is higher resolution, so higher grid spacing, higher resolution grid spacing on the order of 1 kilometer, more vertical levels, even more rapid data cycling. We think as we go down into higher, finer grid spacing, that we will probably need to make the cycling, the data assimilation cycling, a little bit finer than the 15 minutes we have now. We also plan to include more on forecast specific observations such as dual polarization, which we have started working on, and lightning and other things, and perhaps also make the forecast intervals shorter and the latency shorter. Right now we're at around 30-minute latency with our forecast and getting it out. But of course the challenge here is the number of cores is much higher, so we're looking at 50,000 cores. And you may, let's see, there we go. Okay, you may notice too that here our grids are slanted. So one of the things that we would like to look at is being able to have grids perhaps that are mobile, that are oriented in different directions, and perhaps that are different sizes based on the forecast needs. So what you need for a squall line, of course, may be a different shape and size than what you need for an isolated supercell case. Okay. So with the Warn on Forecast starter in mind, what we're looking at over approximately the next 3 years is to continue and expand real-time operational and testbed evaluation activities. That's really important to get users in the feedback loop to the research, and also the user needs into what we're doing. Of course, we will continue to quantify Newsy's skill, but we would like to focus more as we run more and more cases over more seasons. We want to be able to differentiate or see if there are differences in performance related to the storm mode and the environment. And for that, we're using object-based verification methods. We also need to develop a real-time spread and skill score for our forecast to provide a measure of ensemble spin-up, again, related to the storm type. We want to use some more advanced post-processing techniques so that we could, perhaps put out some things not only that are calibrated, but that could, limit the number of variables that or products that would need to go out to a forecaster. So you don't need to perhaps look at, instead of looking at 10 things, maybe you can look at 3 things. And this bottom bullet here, I haven't mentioned this specifically yet, but I'm going to mention it now because it is relevant and important. You may have heard that the National Weather Service and MSEP, we're moving to a unified modeling system. And so as a part of that, the use of FE3 in a regional convective allowing model ensemble is being explored, and some work is going on with that. Will happen at GSD and EMC and NSSL as well. And so with that being in the possibility in the future, as well as HURI being a possibility around 2020, one of our goals is to remain as agile as possible and be able to plug into whatever parent model ends up becoming available at EMC. So that's everything I have. I really look forward to your questions, and I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Like she said, questions are more than welcome. You can see our email address there if you're watching on Google later. But right now, if there are any questions on the hashtag NWAWebWeds, go ahead and send those in. I haven't seen anything. Trevor hasn't mentioned anything. But if there are no questions yet, I have one of my own for you, Pam.
Okay.
So has there been any research, you mentioned on severe weather and flash flooding events, but has there been any research on other mesoscale events like a snow squall or perhaps an eye wall?
Oh, good question. So I know that there have been some very preliminary looks at things like snow squalls. Nothing's been published on that yet. That topic is definitely within our repertoire, but not immediately, because we're trying to, like get the kind of what we were first funded to do done first.
Sure.
So it's a great question. It's in, maybe our longer term goals to look at that, as soon as we have time to. In terms of hurricanes, we are also are exploring the capability to put a nest, say within a hurricane model that would be like more on forecast like. That hasn't happened yet, but we are in the early exploratory stages on that, and Nusrat Youssef is leading that effort.
Gotcha. Sounds great. Becca, Trevor, you got anything?
I have a question for you, Pam. This is Becca. Curious as to how you guys will be working with the private industry to bring Warn on Forecast, the system itself, to the private industry. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
Well, that's a really good question. I think initially, what we have in mind is that, when Warn on Forecast becomes operational, it would be available to private industry, as any other forecast model would be. But that certainly doesn't leave out opportunities for collaborations, through the appropriate channels with members of private industry. And, perhaps one that comes to mind, when I was down talking with the Southern region, there were people from American Airlines and Southwest Airlines there. So, maybe there are, some potential applications that could be relevant to a group like that.
Awesome, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So far, no questions from Twitter. We've got our eye on it. Keep them coming.
I got another question for you, Pam.
Okay.
How has the speed of recent technology, so to speak, like phased array or GO16, changed how you have been in research and development with this?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So there have been some studies, at least 2 that have been published, I believe, looking at phased array radar data assimilation of phased array radar type observations. And so the first one on that was an Aussie type experiment where they're simulating radar reflectivity data in a manner that would be similar to a phased array radar as compared to a traditional WSR-88D scan. And so within that study, I believe they saw the evolution of a supercell. They were able to see that evolution more quickly, and it also was evolved with the correct intensity better than the WSR-88D. So I remember that, and there's been a real data study that just came out, I think within the last couple of months, that used real data and I believe showed similar results in the real world environment. However, those are just a few cases, one being, very experimental, the second one real data case. And so there's a project called Sensor, which is funding continued research in that area. And so we have some folks here who are going to be looking at a whole variety of cases along that line and looking at impact on the forecast. So what was your second part of that?
My other, besides phased array, GO16.
Ah, yes. Okay. Yep. So Thomas Jones at NSSL, through collaboration with others, has been our satellite expert. And I know that he is looking at using the assimilation of GOES 16 satellite data as well. And so as soon as that available, that as those data are available, that should be part of the package that we produced.
I see we've got one question here on the webinar now for you.
Okay.
The question is, what are the plans to effectively explain the differences in the new system to the general public, and how can those of us in the media assist in this process?
Okay. So for the general public, that's a really great question. How can we explain this? So I think one way to think about it is that currently the warnings that we're producing are limited by the radar data that's available. Okay. Oh, my phone's ringing. Okay. So the maximum warning lead time, that you can get is dependent on the environment as well as the kind of the precursors that can be seen in the weather radar data. And so of course there's a limitation to what can be gained from that. With Warn on Forecast, we have the capability to actually use a forecast to provide information about how that storm is going to evolve and what its attributes are going to look like. And so that helps to extend the time ahead of a warning for which we can provide alerts to the public, whether it be an outlook, like a 1 hour outlook, or whether it be an advisory like the WFO in Norman issued, or whether it becomes something that can actually be used in a direct warning application.
Okay. I've got another question here for you. Similar to one of the questions that I asked. When will the Newsy and Warn on Forecast data assimilation be down to 1 minute time scale to be able to benefit from GO16 imagery?
Data assimilation at 1 minute, is that what the question is?
Yeah.
Okay, well, data assimilation at 1 minute, that would be, actually assimilating at 1 minute, like having an analysis, every 1 minute, I think is probably far down the road. And I think one would need to look at the benefit from that from a scientific perspective, because we know that there's a limit on how far out observations have benefit in a forecast. And so especially, as you go more rapidly, unless you're at a resolution that can fully take advantage of some of those observations, you may lose benefit as you go closer and closer in time. So I think that some research needs to be conducted to look at what that trade space looks like and the limitations of where the benefit is versus not.
Okay. We've got plenty of questions coming into the webinar chat box now. I'm going to go back to one question here in a minute, kind of going out of order here as they're popping in, but being asked to recap the definition of what a core is and what Newsy is.
What is a core?
Yeah.
Oh no. All right, so a core, I cannot tell you exactly because I do not have a background in modeling, but I can tell you the cord has many nodes, and that's about it. So I feel kind of silly not quite being able to answer that question really well, but essentially a core is a unit within a system used to run a model, and the more of those you have, the faster you can usually run the system, and the finer the detail, like the finer the grid spacing that you can handle as you have more cores. So you maybe think of it as like the size of a hard drive on a computer. And that's probably the best I can do on that question. And what was the second part of that?
General overview of what Newsy is again.
Okay. Okay. So Newsy is an experimental prototype, convective allowing modeling system, and that prototype is focused on providing short-term forecasts, ensemble forecasts, for use from essentially the watch scale to the warning scale. And from the ensemble, we can produce products we think that are useful, such as probabilities of exceedance of any output, any product that can be produced by the model, as well as ranges of magnitudes associated with that ensemble to give you things such as what might the minimum be, what might a maximum reasonable value be.
Okay. One more question going back to GOES 16. Do you plan on using the global lightning mapper data?
That is a question for Thomas Jones. So if that person would like to email Thomas Jones, thomas.jones@noaa.gov, please send him a message.
Okay. Trevor, do you have anything on Twitter yet?
I'll speak for Trevor. We do not have any questions on Twitter.
All right. I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up a couple minutes. Oh, there's one more just popped in. Going back to one of your maps about mid-presentation, how did you arrive at 40 dBz threshold?
How did we arrive at a 40 dBz threshold?
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, the 40 dBz threshold in some of these plots were shown because they were put together for aviation capabilities, and that tends to be 35 to 40 dBz is the threshold at which aircraft supposedly will not fly through storms. However, the threshold that is used to produce those probabilities, we use multiple thresholds, and you can really use any threshold that you would want within this system. So, for more intense convection, you could look at things like 50 or 60 dBz thresholds, for example.
Okay. That's all the questions that I see in the chat box, and nothing on Twitter yet. So I'll go ahead and wrap up here. I wanted to thank Pam for stopping in and sharing this exciting presentation with us. I'm very excited to see where Newsy goes in the next decade. If there are any other questions, we'll be watching the hashtag NWAWebWed here for a little while. Otherwise, this presentation will be up in the next couple of days on YouTube. Our next webinar will be after the annual meeting of the American Meteorological Society. A likely date is January 17th. We are shooting to post some personal experiences with this year's hurricanes. There was a lot of forecasters that were kind of in ground zero this year, especially in Key West and around the Corpus Christi, Houston area. So we'll have some of those experiences from multiple sectors within those hurricanes. I think that'll be a very interesting conversation, because we all know as meteorologists that we all get caught in the crosshairs every once in a while, and I think especially with Irma crossing the Keys, that'll be a great experience to hear from those folks down there. Rebecca, do you have anything to add to that?
Nope, that sounded great.
Okay, so we haven't set the time yet, but again, that'll be January 17th. And watch all of the NWA media, Twitter, Facebook, yada, yada, yada. And hopefully we'll see a few of you at the annual meeting of the AMS in a few weeks. So again, thank you, Pam, for this fantastic presentation.
Yep, thank you.